Okay, hello to everybody. Today is Friday, November 8th, and obviously we missed class yesterday, Thursday, November 7th, and that's kind of an unfortunate thing, but these things happen, and I thought it was appropriate for me to do a recording of what I was going to talk about in class last night. So hopefully this will serve as a good replacement for that. Obviously, we will miss the sort of back and forth since I'm recording this in Zoom, and I'm going to post a link. It's going to be uploaded to my YouTube channel. There's no passcode required. Obviously, if you're hearing me, then you already figured out that there's no passcode. I felt it was important to do this. Number one, we had a sort of an abbreviated class session last week. We only had 3 people in class. That was Halloween, and missed class on Thursday because the campuses were closed. I would have probably tried to do something had I had the equipment in my house to record something, but I don't, and I don't have a camera or anything like that. So I decided I would come into campus today to record this. So that's what we're going to do. The other thing too is that I don't want to get behind, and I'll talk a bit about where we are with the schedule. I don't want to get behind because we're already in week 3. We're nearing the halfway point, frankly, and we just can't lose a week. You have to keep in mind also we're going to lose a week, and I think it's week 6 for the Thanksgiving holiday, which is obviously a Thursday, which is when our class is scheduled. So, and as I mentioned to the class on the very first day of class, that my plan there is, as I've done before, in other fall fast track terms, recorded video, probably that Wednesday before, and post that for the class that we would have on that Thanksgiving day. So we just can't miss too many days of a 7-week semester when there's only 1 class session per week. So anyway, that's sort of the logic of this. And if anybody has any questions about anything I've talked about, feel free to reach out. I'm available all weekend and pretty much every day throughout the week. So hopefully you'll find me to be available. I just want to go over where we ended up. So we really covered the last week, which was week 2, the end of chapter 2. And I just sort of began opening the door to chapter 3, demand and supply. And I'm just going to start over. I only got maybe 5 minutes into the demand and supply discussion, so I'm going to sort of start over with that today. And I want to cover all of chapter 3. It's a pretty foundational chapter. It sort of goes in some ways, in my mind at least, goes along with Appendix A, which is sort of a refresher, a jump start, whatever you want to call it, about the sort of the graphical view of how we present economic models, situations, intended policy effects, and all that. And so demand and supply is really sort of a micro chapter in a lot of ways. As I mentioned earlier on in the class, that we assume that nobody's had economics before. If you have, that's great. But we start from the very beginning. And some of this builds on microeconomic foundation, which is what demand and supply is about, where it's the individual market for individual goods. And so we're going to cover that today. Then I want to move into, after that, we'll move into chapter 6, which is really the first true macro chapter. And from there on out, it'll be all macro all the time. And I do want to get into talking about what some of the macro variables are like. And then if we are able to get to the unemployment piece, we will. I don't want to make this an exceptionally long video because I'm not sure how many people will watch it if I do a 4-hour video or whatever. And I don't even want to go to 3 hours, I think. But I'm not sure that I'll get to the employment bit, but I'll do what I can on that. And if we can get to unemployment today, that's great. If we don't, it's really not a big crisis because, as we'll see here, chapter 8 and chapter 9 sort of go together. And they go together in the sense that unemployment and inflation are considered to be trade-offs for one another when it comes to policy decisions. And by the way, the other thing is the chapter 10 piece is not very long. And we don't get into very much about the international picture in this course. We just don't really have the time to do it. And for those of you who are interested in that, there are other courses down the road that may interest you in that regard. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started here. And I want to just pick up with demand and supply. And by the way, what I'll do is I'll post the link, these PowerPoints, these files, probably tonight sometime. So you can make sure to look at them. Remember to do the discussion activities. I mean, we still, just because we weren't in class yesterday, it doesn't mean the discussions are not required. And the quiz, you'll still want to do that. So be aware that those are still pending for this week, and so you want to do those. And I think this week deals with, I believe, with demand and supply. I have to take a look, but it's a really important sort of piece of the puzzle. Hopefully, you've all read most of chapter 3. It's not a particularly long chapter, and one of the virtues of this particular text, which is a free e-text, is that the chapters really are not very long, and as opposed to some of the books that we've used in the past, where the chapters are pretty lengthy at times. This is a very compact presentation of a lot of what we're doing here. So what I'm going to do, because this is a video, and I know this is not a perfect system, but I'm going to sort of be flipping back and forth between the PowerPoint package. This is what I created. This is my own presentation, and some of the work I'll do on the whiteboard. And obviously, for me to be able to project a video, I've got to have the light on, so it's going to look a little bit weird. But I recorded this room in another course that I teach, and I've not heard any complaints about being able to see things. And the good news about a YouTube video is you can stop it, rewind, blow it up, expand it, whatever, so that in some ways maybe even more advantageous than a live presentation. But let's talk about demand and supply and what it's about. We've all heard the term demand and supply, or supply and demand, which is, I think, how we sort of hear it in the real world. And I think most of us are fairly familiar with what it is, just sort of intuitively. If somebody asks the question, why is gasoline as high as it is? And somebody may come back and say, well, it's supply and demand. And that's not a particularly rigorous definition, but it's enough to really communicate the idea that we sort of all understand the dynamics of demand and supply. But what we're going to do here in this chapter, in this module, is we're going to sort of drill down into it a little bit. First, we'll take demand first, in order to sort of understand what some of the underlying features are of demand. So let's talk about what demand is, first of all. Demand, and I know I went over a bit of this on the Halloween night, but I'm just going to go back just a bit in order to go forward. So the definition is the ability and willingness of potential buyers to purchase goods at various prices and quantities. And the term goods is going to be a euphemism for goods and services. One of the things that I think I mentioned on the first night of class was, when we talk about goods, we sort of use this term to be a sort of a catch-all for all output that suppliers provide in the economy. Whether it's a physical good that's inventoriable that you can move around, or whether it's a service that does not have an inventoriable or even a physical nature. So when we're talking about goods, we're also talking about services. As we get into the beginning of the macro piece in chapter 6, we'll sort of give you a bit of an illustration of what some of these, the components of output in the economy look like. So let's take a look at this definition. It's the ability and willingness. They both got to go together. I may have the ability to buy a good, but no willingness to buy it. So therefore, I'm not on the demand side of this market. But I no longer smoke cigarettes, and so as a result, to me, it's irrelevant what the price of cigarettes are. I'm not interested in buying them, and so as a result, I have the ability, but no willingness. Likewise, I may have the willingness to buy a mansion on the beach in Malibu, but maybe don't have the ability to do it. So therefore, I'm not going to be on the demand side. No one's going to waste time speaking to me about that. So it's got to be ability and willingness both together, not either or, but both together. That puts you on the demand side. And this gives way to what is a bit more quantitative definition, and it's called the law of demand. As I think I mentioned in class last week, that we have very few laws in economics. And this differs from mathematics and physics and chemistry, where you have laws that are hard and fast, and they can be numerically stated, and they're not going to change over long time periods. In economics, we have really two: the law of demand and the law of supply. And we may have other relationships that sometimes are called laws, like there's something called Okun's law, which is an issue related to output and unemployment, but it's not really that rigorous. And in fact, it's been revised over time. So if it's been revised, how does that make it a law? A law is, being in science, something that we can quantitatively state in formulaic terms, and it will always be accurate. And by the way, in the law of demand, there are some violators of the law of demand, which we won't get to. If you take a micro course, maybe you would get to that. But I can't think of any violators of the law of supply, because it just almost doesn't make sense. But the law of demand says this: the price, P, and quantity, Q, are inversely or negatively related. That is, if one thing goes up, the other thing goes down. So the law of demand, basically stated, looks something like this. And it's basically, we're laying out the relationship between price and quantity. That if the price of a good goes up, the quantity will go down, specifically the quantity demanded. We'll put a little subscript D for quantity demanded so that we can differentiate quantity demanded from quantity supplied. And if the price of a good goes down, the quantity demanded goes up. And this is not a particularly, striking or surprising result. I think most of us know that if the price of something goes up, very fewer people are going to demand it because either they're priced out of the market or they simply don't want to pay the price. And so as a result, the price goes up, the quantity is going to go down, not the supply, which sometimes people get confused with these terms. We have to talk about price and quantity, not price and supply, or not price and demand. Price and quantity are both elements of demand. Likewise, if the price comes down, more people are priced into it, so they are going to buy more output. So if the price of a good falls, we're going to see more quantity exchanged in the market. And we'll talk about this issue of connecting price and quantity here in a minute. And then I want to talk about this idea of movements along the demand curve, and they're due to changes in price. And so let me just sort of lay this out for you. And I want to sort of get a little bit graphical here in order for us to illustrate what demand looks like from a graphic perspective. And this is going to be really the first of what are going to be quite a large number of models that we're going to be building in this course. And simply put, the model is simply a graphic representation of a particular phenomenon. It's a roadmap, it's a simulation, it's just another way of looking at things. We can talk about and discuss and communicate economic phenomena in different ways. We can do it verbally and just say price goes up, quantity goes down, whatever, or we can do it all mathematically, which we haven't done here, and we're not going to get into much of that. I promised the class earlier on we would not get very deeply into the mathematics. Or another way is by a graphic representation. And I know that a lot of people learn in different ways. Some learn better by reading text. Others are very mathematically oriented. It's just the way our brains are configured, and we're all different. And another is visually. And a lot of people are very visual learners. And if we can combine all of these together, particularly the textual as well as the graphical, I think it makes for easier viewing. So we're going to go to this Cartesian plane here. Remember, we had 1, 2, 3, 4 quadrants that we talked about. And remember, in the Cartesian coordinates, we have an origin here, and we have a y-axis here, and we have an x-axis here. Well, we're going to simply, from now on, in this particular this particular module, y is going to be p, the price of a good, and x is going to be quantity of a good. So, and we simply refer to this as a PQ plane. A PQ plane, a plane being this two-dimensional space in which we can lay out the relationships between price and quantity for any particular good to the extent that we're able to do it. And what we're saying in the law of demand is that the relationship is inversely related. That is, if the price is higher, quantity demanded is lower and whatnot. And demand estimation is something that, for those of you who may study further accounting, or I'm sorry, economics courses in the future, maybe you get a little bit deeper into this, maybe not. But it's a way that we can sort of put together the information, and we can do a number of different research methods to determine what the data looks like, and we'll have some outliers and whatnot. But if we use a statistical smoothing method, we can get a downward sloping curve, which we're going to mostly represent as straight lines or slightly curvy, and we'll simply label that D for the demand curve. And what does that mean? It basically means this. We don't know, this is just a generic product, but let's say the price here, quantity 1, is going to be $15, and the demand side's, I'm sorry, the quantity is 15, based upon a price, which we're going to call P1, is, let's say, 20, okay? And we don't know what the good in question is. What if the price goes up for whatever reason? And we don't know what the reasons are. Let's say it goes to 25. In other words, the price goes up, the quantity demanded is going to go down to, say, 10. So this is an illustration of the inverse relationship. Q1 goes to Q2. In other words, there's a fall because, and this is the price is often the causal driver of this, because price has gone up. Now, why did price go up? Well, we don't know. And we'll talk about some reasons why price may change. Oftentimes, it's due to something going on in the other side of the market, that is with supply. It could be due to a lot of things. It could be due to government action, trying to price the good up. And if for those of you who will maybe go on to do a bachelor's degree in business, I think some of you are, you'll probably take a microeconomics course at some point, and we'll be exposed to some of the discussion about government price controls, where sometimes government will try to lift the price of a product. But whatever the case is, we don't really know, don't really care. But one thing we do know is this, that at this ordered pair here that we call P1, Q1, that's the ordered pair, it has now changed to become P2, Q2. And in other words, what's happening is the price of the good has changed, and so there's a sliding along the demand curve. There's a movement up and down along the demand curve. And so what can we say about this? The thing that we just said, that I noted in the PowerPoint slide, was the idea that if there's a movement along the demand curve, it's due to a change in price. And really only due to a change in price, for reasons that really don't concern us, because there could be a lot of different reasons, some of which we're going to get to here before we end up this discussion of chapter 3. But the key thing is that we know that something is going on that's going to change the price of the good, and so the quantity demand is going to change. By the way, if the price went down, say it went down to here, then quantity demand will be way out here, and we would see it sliding back down along the demand curve. So the thing to know about this is the idea that movements along the demand curve, and as we'll see in a minute, also along the supply curve, are due to changes in price, and only changes in price. And that's the thing that I think we want to remember here, and reinforce in our moments, that the idea is that we're only seeing a movement along that curve when it's a change in price. Okay. All right. So what makes the demand curve itself change? And we're going to talk about some of these issues where the demand curve itself may not be constant. And let's talk about what some of these things are. And before we do that, and before we go through some of these causes, and I guess I should not have probably taken my screen down, I guess, is to talk about this idea of shifts. Okay. So remember, movements along the demand curve, like what we've illustrated here, are due to changes in price and only changes in price. But what about this? What about if we have some other kind of phenomenon going on where, let's say that over time we have something like this going on. We have a quantity on this axis, we have price on this axis. That's the standard way that we present it. And we have a demand curve, and we're going to say that demand curve, we're going to call it D1. Okay? And everywhere along this demand curve, we got this inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. But let's say that, and let's say for right now, just for our purposes, that we've got, this is associated with some price 1 and the order pair relationship, price P1, Q1, and that's a point along this, this curve or this function. By the way, a graphical representation like this, whether it's a straight line or whether it's a curve, is simply the graphical relationship of a function. And I think we ought to, there's a reason why we in Appendix A, I talk quite a lot about this idea of functions and the functional relationships. That is, one thing goes with another thing, and there's only one P1, Q1 at this particular relationship. Now think about what happens. Let's say that we notice over time that the data are drifting. And so now we can simply say, oh, something's happened. Now we've got some movement in the entire function itself. In other words, that we've got some shift to the right. And at the same P1 now we've got some Q2. Price hasn't changed at all. Price hasn't changed at all. And so what's happening here is this. We have a shift. And a shift in demand, which means the entire equation, whatever that formula is, which we're not going to get into here, but if it's a function, it must have an equation, and something in that equation has changed. And I'm going to get to some of the factors that can cause that. But a shift in demand, it represents a change in overall demand. Okay, so it's a change in overall demand, whatever is going on. Okay. And it's due to always changes in non-price variables. Due to a change. It could be one change, it could be multiple ones, but I don't want to overly complicate this. Due to a change in what we call non-price variables. And we're going to get to those here in just a second, just to show what they are. Like, it could be a change in income. That's a pretty obvious one, and that's one we'll talk about in a minute. But notice what's going on here. At the same P1, now people will demand more units of output, and it does not represent any kind of price change at all. So we're saying price may not change at all. So remember, what is an important thing for us to remember with demand, and as we'll see, the supply discussion is going to be very similar, and that is movements along these curves, whether it's demand and later, as we'll see with supply, are due to changes in price, and really only changes in price. A shift, though, where the entire function changes, the entire equation changes, is due to some non-price variable. Something that's outside the system, something that's not modeled here, but it causes a shift. And notice too, one important thing is, this is a rightward shift. And let's be clear about what a rightward shift is going to be all about. And it's going to take us a little bit longer to go through demand than it is to supply, mostly because some of the dynamics of these shifts are going to be the same with demand and with supply. Different factors, but in terms of where they look mechanically, they're going to be similar. The reason why is because they're on the same plane, they're on the same playing field with the same variables. And so when we talk about a rightward shift in demand, we're saying it's an increase in overall demand. It's an increase in overall demand. And that's what a rightward shift is. And what I'd like everyone to think of is, I know that, and I know econ textbooks sort of maybe confuse the issue at times, and that's unfortunate. That's not the intent at all, but sometimes it does sort of become a little bit confusing in the sense that we'll talk about an increase in demand, and people will want us to think about up and down. And I'm going to encourage you to not think up and down, but to think right left. In other words, orient yourself here to the origin. And so anytime on this particular graphic plane, and by the way, we're going to be using a first quadrant plane for the macro models that we'll do as well. But if it's to the right, think of it like a number line, right? If it's to the right, it's an increase, and if it's to the left, it's a decrease. Why is it an increase? It's moving away from the origin in a positive direction. So it's a rightward shift. The entire curve is moving, and so as a result, it's an increase. If it's moving to the left, it's moving back toward the origin in a negative manner. And so that is a decrease. And so what does that look like from the standpoint of the demand supply? I'm sorry, from the demand model here. It's going to simply look something like this. And it's going to be, everything's going to be the same here, with the exception of the fact that we have P and Q, and we have P and Q going on, and we have some demand curve we'll call D1, and it's associated with the ordered pair here is going to be the same setup where this is D1, where we're going to have some P1, it's going to be associated with some initial Q1, but now something has changed and demand has fallen. In other words, it's moved left and we have a decrease. And so now at that same P1, people are going to demand less of it, not because of a price change, but because of some other factor, and that is a decrease in demand. And so when we talk about a demand here, we've got a leftward shift, and we're going to say that a leftward shift in demand is a decrease in overall demand. And it's due to some change in a non-price variable. And what is that non-price variable? We'll get to that in a second, but that's what's going on there. And again, don't think of up, down. And by the way, if you do think of up and down, it'll confuse you when we get to supply, because if you're thinking up, down, in other words, if you're thinking vertically as opposed to horizontally, it's going to really confuse you when it gets to supply, and I'll get to that here in just a second. So that's really what's going on here. We need to be sure and be clear that we have to differentiate movements along the demand curve from changes in overall demand. One is simply a movement up and down along the same function, whatever we call it, D1 or whatever, and it's due to some price change for reasons that probably have to do with something going on the other side of the market, and we'll get to that modeling here shortly. And that differs from a shift in the overall function that's due to some non-price variable. And let's talk about what some of these non-price variables are. So let's go back to the PowerPoint slide that I probably brought up a little bit earlier. And let's talk about what some of these factors are. What are some of these non-price variables that we need to be aware of? And so among those are these, and we call them the determinants of demand. It's sort of the DNA of demand. It's really we can incorporate this into formulas, and I know that this is a bit beyond where we want to go in this course, but for those of you who are, may take an intermediate course in economics in the future, you probably will get into more of the functional construction in terms of equations and whatnot. But for right now, let's just know that these are non-price variables known as the determinants of demand. This is what can cause shifts. Number one is something called the income effect. And I sort of mentioned changes in income a bit earlier. And income is a pretty important one. I think most of us can agree. Now, I just gave you a generic model of some good. We don't even know what kind of a good it is. We're going to assume it's a normal good. That is, most goods are called normal goods because of the fact that the demand goes in the same direction as income. If our incomes go up, we demand more of these goods. If our income goes down, we demand less of these goods. It's both from a micro level. If we lose our jobs, our incomes are going to go down. We're going to demand fewer luxury goods, and all luxury goods are normal goods. But not all normal goods are luxuries, but we'll probably buy less of everything. We may even downsize our living arrangements. Maybe we have a 3-bedroom apartment, we'll go to a 2-bedroom apartment. We have 2 cars, we dial it down to 1 car. We reduce our phone plan. I mean, you get the idea. Income is a big determinant of demand for a lot of goods, for what we call normal goods. And I went through this sort of pairing in week 1 about the difference between normal goods and inferior goods. There are goods that are called inferior goods, and they're always substitutes for normal goods. And that is, our incomes are falling, we'll demand more of these goods, not less. And they include things like generics and substitutes, which are less expensive. So maybe instead of going to the movies, maybe we get a pay-per-view movie or something. It's cheaper, it's not the same thing, but it's a substitute. So as a result, that's what's going on. So income is a big determinant. And by the way, income is going to be an important factor when it comes to overall demand in the economy as we get into talking about the dynamics of chapter 6. Also the wealth effect. Now these look like the same thing, but they're really not. Here's the thing about the wealth effect. It's a little trickier. And I think a lot of times people get these confused, and they sort of confuse income and wealth, and they are different. Income will be measured as the periodic inflow of resources, usually money, but it's measured in dollar terms and over a particular time period. But wealth is more of a snapshot, right? It's kind of like if you take an accounting before, we have the income statement that's sort of the motion picture that may run from January 1st to December 31st, and then we start a new motion picture over again. Then the wealth effect is like the balance sheet where we take a picture as of a certain time frame, and this is how we reflect the current holdings. And so wealth is different. The wealth effect is a little bit trickier because it's more about how wealthy people feel as opposed to how wealthy they are. And I know that this is an area that sort of is a little bit nebulous, because when we say how people feel, well, what do we mean by that? Well, one of the problems is we sometimes don't really know how wealthy we are, particularly for a lot of our holdings are in the form of real estate. Like, I really do not know what the value of my house is. I really don't. I have an idea, and I pull up Zillow, and I think Zillow's probably got it wrong, honestly. I don't think my house is worth what they think it is. So that gives me a bit of ambiguity in that regard. Also, a lot of people's wealth are tied up in things like stocks, bonds, which may be in the form of their 401k, and they may not look at their 401k very often. If the markets are going down, they probably definitely don't look at it because they don't want to get depressed and learn how much they've lost in the last 3 months or whatever. So the wealth effect is very often about not only how wealthy we are, and if we go in the same direction as income, if we feel wealthier, we're more likely to buy a new car as opposed to not. If we feel less wealthy, we're less likely to buy a new car or to go on vacation or to buy a new house or to whatever. All these things, maybe, buy a motorcycle or a jet ski, something that is maybe an unnecessary item, but something we want. And if we feel wealthy, we're more likely to buy it as opposed to not buying it. And it really depends on how we feel, okay? Another big one here is changes in taste and preferences. And sometimes a lot of econ textbooks will sort of move this to the very top, and that's fine. And this is not a hierarchical listing. They're not in any order that says this is more important than the other. These are all factors, not all of which are going to apply in the demand for any particular good in a micro context that is an individual market. But taste and preferences are simply this. Sometimes we like certain things and we don't like certain things over time. And our tastes change as buyers. And there are goods that sort of lose their allure over time. Sometimes because they're replaced by other goods, and so we no longer have the demand for those that we once did, simply because of the fact that there are other options out there. In other words, our tastes are changing and preferences and whatnot. Sometimes those goods are introduced and now we decide we really like these goods and we all now start to pile in. And this is an area that, for those who are interested in marketing, this is such a big area and it's such a difficult area to forecast if you're a seller of goods, particularly those goods which are very subject to cyclical effects in the economy. People will back off when the economies are bad. They'll dive in jump in when the economy is good. So it's difficult to know, and it's an area that really, I think probably it's safe to say that marketing people know probably a little bit more about tastes and preferences than what economists do. And that's just kind of the way it is. Okay. Prices of related goods, substitutes and complements. Okay. And we get into this a lot more in microeconomics. So for those who will take a micro course in the future, most business schools require that micro is taken at some point. And if we're talking about a substitute good, if a substitute for some good in question is falling, then it's likely that we will buy less of whatever our good is. So whatever that substitute is, so if we're selling beef, for instance, maybe we're a hamburger chain, and the price of chicken is falling, and chicken and beef are not the same good, but they are substitutes. Then if the price of chicken is falling, people will probably demand more chicken because of the lower price. And they'll simply go down along that demand curve for chicken, and they'll shift to the left, the demand for beef, simply because the substitute is now more profitable. And it goes in the other direction as well, too. If we're selling beef and chicken prices go through the roof for whatever reason, then we're probably going to see a shift to the right in beef, our good itself. Complements are another issue as well. It's a related good. And complementary goods are those goods which either go together because they kind of make sense. Hot dogs and hot dog buns are both complements. So the prices of those goods are going to change. If the price of hot dogs goes up, people demand fewer hot dogs. They're going to demand fewer hot dog buns. Why on earth would you buy hot dog buns if you're not buying hot dogs? I mean, you can, but it's not really done. So those goods go together, and the price of one influences something of the other. And by the way, this is an important thing to know if you're a seller of goods, because it's important to know what's going on in a complementary market. So if you go back to this example of buns, when I was a commercial lender, we had a customer that made hamburger buns for major fast food chains. There were a couple in particular. And I remember, this was probably, 30 years ago maybe, and there was some sort of E. coli scare, and people were getting really sick, and I think some people died eating fast food hamburgers. And so there was for a time, it wasn't a long period of time, but a month or two, people were really staying away from hamburger places. Jack in the Box was one of the offenders, and so our company was making hamburger buns. They had nothing whatsoever at all to do with E. coli because it was infecting the beef, making people sick. But because they were selling a complementary good, their demand really, really suffered. And it's not like they can just turn off the production of buns, but they sort of had to. And I think they laid workers off for a bit until they recovered, and they were really worried about as to whether or not this would be a long-term thing. But that's an example of the fact that complementary goods oftentimes influence the demand for any other good, even though the good in question, the two goods are different, made by different producers, different markets, different cost pictures. They just go together in the final consumption, and so that's an area that we should think about. Also, the number of goods in the market, number of buyers in the market, I'm sorry, where if more people are flocking to the market, the demand curve is probably going to shift right. If people are leaving the market, the demand curve is going to shift left. And there are a lot of goods in which, over time, people just no longer want that good, so they start to move to the left, to the point where the demand curve shifts so far left, it basically hits the axis, we're down to zero, and nobody produces those goods anymore. One example that sort of comes to mind is sewing machines. And I think I can't remember if it was this class I had. We had a fairly long discussion about sewing machines, and I'm old enough to remember the fact that a lot of households have a sewing machine, because in the old days, if you tore a hole in your jeans, your kid's jeans, you would simply put a patch on it. People just throw stuff away now. They don't really do that. People don't really have sewing machines, in fact. So because they don't buy sewing machines. There aren't too many companies still making them. In fact, I think Singer, which was an old company that made sewing machines, sort of got out of that business to produce some other products, and I think related to defense products themselves. So you get the idea. People over time leave the market. It could also be due to changes in tastes and preferences. And by the way, these can all work in sort of combination in weird ways, and that's how economists sort of pick apart what's going on with demand in the market. One other example we talked in terms of a leftward shift is during COVID. There were a number of articles that I thought were very interesting because we certainly have a lot of gaming in this state that is legalized gambling, and people were staying away from casinos in Vegas. And so as a result, demand for hotel stays and for all the gaming that they were doing was all shifting left because of COVID. And even though I think these casinos were still open, the hotels were still open, people were staying away, and they were staying away from a lot of things for obvious reasons. And so the question became, what happened to the demand curve with some of these goods? And that was just an example. And by the way, we could do an entire semester on the economic effects of COVID. And I think it's going to take us years to sort of figure out what the long-term impacts were on that. Government policy, we're going to talk a lot about this, not so much tonight or today, but in this video, but we're going to get to that probably next week, week 4, and talk about the idea of what the effect of taxes are and what the effect of government spending is. Bottom line is, if we're talking about a shift here, if taxes are going up, okay, and we'll simply call that T for taxes, these are tax dollars. These are all dollar figures. If taxes are going up, then we're going to probably see a leftward shift in demand for almost all goods. If taxes are going down, we're going to see a rightward shift. And that is, taxes are simply another layer of price. Even though it's not a price, it's a non-price variable. It's outside of the system because taxes aren't handled by buyers and sellers. They're always imposed by government. That's the whole point. And so that's really an issue. Also, government spending and is going to be a thing we're going to get to. And I'll start to introduce a little bit about what the effects of government spending are on all markets, including the macroeconomy as we get going. Regulation, it works in much the same way as taxes. If regulation is increasing, probably demand for goods are going to go down, probably because the costs are going to go up. This is something imposed by government. Only government imposes regulation for the most part. And I mean, I suppose there's some self-regulation where if companies are finding themselves subject to lawsuits for some products, they'll make things more difficult to buy. And that because of the higher costs of their own compliance with, trying to stay out of court and whatnot. So regulation, we'll get to this a little bit. This is more of a micro topic, but bottom line, it works in the same way taxation does. More regulation means there's probably a depressed demand for goods, certainly a depressed supply. We'll get to that in a second. And if it goes down, then obviously it works in the other direction. And then the final one, which is something we're going to get into a lot more in a theoretical macro sense, and that's something called regulation or called expectations. And expectations really inform a lot of the issues surrounding demand, and that is, if people expect the economy to do better and they expect their own situation to be better, they're more likely to demand more goods, and the demand curve for a lot of goods will shift to the right. If they feel very negatively about things, they're going to demand less of goods, and the demand curve is going to shift to the left as a decrease. So the thing about expectations is this is an important part of a lot of where we're going in macro, is that these expectations of buyers oftentimes form what we would refer to as a self-fulfilling prophecy. If I think the economy is going to be better next year, and not only me, but also everyone I know and people across the economy think the economy is going to do much better, we're going to buy more. We're going to buy a new car. We're going to go on vacation, take a longer vacation. We're going to buy more clothes. We're going to keep our lights on. We're not going to turn our lights off every time we leave a room or whatnot. We feel better about things, and so we're going to demand more goods. And as a result, the economy grows as a result of that positive expectation. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And this is, by the way, where we sort of get into the intersection of politics and economics. And we're going to talk much more about this intersection here of political science and economics. And that is, government leaders, particularly presidents, will always try to paint the rosiest picture they can of the economy because they know that people who are happier are going to demand more goods. The economy is going to be better. If the economy is going to be better, it's going to be better for their own particular political fortunes. And so they will always try to talk the economy up as opposed to talking it down. I can only think of in my lifetime one US president who ever talked the economy down. It was Jimmy Carter, who was turned out of office mostly because of the fact that people did not feel very good about things. And I'm not trying to get political here. I just think it's a fact that things weren't looking very good. And they really weren't that great during the time in which he was in office. But he also didn't try to lift people's spirits. And so that's an important part of it. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we think the economy is going to be bad next year, we're not going to buy a new car. We're going to repair the old car that we've got. We're not going to go on vacation. Or if we do go on vacation, we're not going to go to Disney World. We're going to go to Cliffs or to a state park or something. Those are and as a result, we're going to spend less. And that is going to result in a slowed down economy. So the expectations game is a big one. And we're going to take this in other directions here as we get into macro theory, which is going to come up in a couple of weeks. It really does make a big difference. Okay? All right, that's demand. Let's talk about the other side of the market, that's supply. So supply, and this will go a little bit faster because we don't have to necessarily get into all the definitions that we did in the discussion of demand. But what's the definition of supply? It's the ability and willingness of potential sellers, in this case, to provide goods for sale at various prices and quantities. The only thing we did was change the word sellers and goods for sale as opposed to goods to be purchased. And here we've got the law of supply, which is different than the law of demand. And the law of supply is not anything too different other than the fact that we're going to be changing some of these terms around. And that is, if the price of a good goes up, the quantity supply, we'll put a little S subscript there to denote quantity supply and to differentiate quantity supply from quantity demanded. Quantity supply is going to go up, not down, but up. So it's different. If the price of it goes down, the quantity supply is going to go down. And this is what we call the law of supply. And it's simply the mathematical expression, the functional expression of how supply works in the economy. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, that because we've only got two main laws in economics, we don't have a lot of these things that are etched in stone. However, and I mentioned that the law of demand had a few violators, a very tiny portion of the economy that had violators, and for reasons that don't really make any difference here. But the law of supply almost does not have violators because it doesn't make a lot of sense for it to go in the other direction. If you're the supplier of a good, you probably can't afford to. If the price of a good is going up, or I'm sorry, the price of a good is going down, you probably can't afford to keep dialing up supply because you're going to take a lower price. The more you supply, the lower price you do take. That really doesn't make a lot of sense. And I'm not saying that never happens ever, because a lot of companies are trying to get going, particularly startups, a lot of tech startups, where they just are trying to get market share and maybe they lose money. And so maybe they're a violator, but not a very long-term violator. You can't keep it up forever. You can only keep it up as long as somebody's willing to fund what are probably inevitable losses. And so the law of supply doesn't have a lot of violators. This is a pretty hard and fast rule in economics. And so just like we talked about with demand, that movements along the demand curve are due to changes in price. The same is true with supply. Movements along the supply curve up and down are due to changes in price and only due to changes in price. Okay? And that differs then from the supply curve. Let's take a bit of a look here at what shifts in the supply curve might look like. And this is I'm really intending this to be sort of a bit of discussion that is going to help us to understand that we need to be thinking about left to right as opposed to up and down. So let's take a look here. Let's take a look at a rightward shift in supply, okay? So we've got a PQ plane looking something like that. And let's say that and we're not talking about movements along the supply curve, we're talking about shifts in overall supply. And by the way, because the price goes up and the quantity supplied goes up, and the price goes down, the quantity supplied goes down, this is a direct or positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. Unlike in the case of demand, where we had an inverse or negative relationship between price and quantity demanded, which means we have a negative slope. Remember that? changing one thing, changing another thing. We have a negative term for slope, and so the demand curve is downward sloping. Here, they go in the same direction. The correlation is positive, and so as a result, the supply curve is going to be looking something like that, upward sloping, which obviously differs from the demand curve in the sense that one goes up, supply, one goes down, demand. And that's not that difficult to imagine as to the reasons why, because we know that in relation to price, buyers and sellers want different things. They want the opposite things. We all know buyers want lower prices, and we all know that sellers want higher prices. And so we have an inherent conflict that plays itself out in markets all day, every day. And when I say conflict, I don't mean to suggest that it's anything violent and necessarily. It doesn't have to be. It usually is not. But it's a conflict nonetheless. And so buyers want lower prices. Buyers are looking for value, looking for discounts. They're shopping around, particularly if it's a big ticket item. If you're going to buy a washing machine, you're probably going to shop around a little bit. If you're going to go on vacation, you're probably going to get the best airline deal you can, the best hotel deal. If it's something like Pop-Tarts, maybe you'll pay a little more. You don't want to run around from store to store just for Pop-Tarts. But if it's a bigger ticket item, for sure, buyers want to get that price down, and sellers want to keep that price up. And just like in the case of demand, movements up and down along the supply curve are due to changes in price. Okay. But what about a shift? And so let's say we have a supply curve, and we have and we're going to call it S1, and we could set up a sort of a generic piece here. We've got an ordered pair that we're going to call P1, Q1. And what do we have here is, let's say there's a shift in supply, and it goes to the right in this case. And so, in other words, and whether or not it needs to be parallel or not, I don't know. Don't worry about whether or not that's the prettiest looking shift in supply. It doesn't matter. The key thing that we should know is that at the same price, there's going to be a higher quantity. So there's a rightward shift. And so a rightward shift in supply is an increase in overall supply. And here's where I say, don't think up, down, because you're going to get confused, because if we keep going to the right, to the right, to the right, to the right, which is an increase, it looks like it's going down if you're thinking about this vertical axis. But don't think about that. Think about the orientation on the number line here, and think about where we are in relation to the origin. If we're moving to the right, it's an increase. Moving to the left, it's a decrease. So this is why I say think about right, left, as opposed to up and down, okay? And then a shift in supply represents a change in overall supply, and it's due to some change in a non-price variable, just as in the case of demand, okay? So nothing too different there. And again, I said that when we talk about these shifts, we're talking about things which are due to something outside of the system. There's something going on. We don't know. It could be something that is like income changes, or could be tax changes. We'll get to that in a second, okay? And then if we talk about the leftward shift in supply, we have a PQ model here, and we have some S1, and we start with some ordered pair that lies along the curve, some P1, Q1, and now we have some moving now to the left. Just like we don't want to think up, down, this looks like it's going up, but it's actually going down. And it means that we've now got, at every price, we've got a lesser quantity supplied because we have a leftward shift or a decrease. So a leftward shift in supply is a decrease in overall supply. And just like the case of demand, any shift left or right is going to be due to a non-price variable that we can refer to as the determinant of supply. It's the thing that causes the shift. It's the thing that causes the change in the function, the supply function, and what we are going to talk about there. Before we put the two together, okay? So let's do that. Let's talk about what this looks like from the perspective of what can change or what can cause changes in supply. So some of these are ones that I think are pretty obvious. So the question is, what can cause supply to shift? The answer is changes in non-price variables, known as the determinants of supply. The big one here that I would put a star by, underline, highlight, and it's so important, is changes in the costs of production. This is, I think, far and away the biggest determinant of supply. And when we talk about the cost of production, we're talking about a difference here between cost and price. And I want to talk about just a little bit about what this is about. And I apologize, I'm just trying to find my eraser here. Let's talk a bit about what cost of production really is. The cost versus price. Cost is the internal cost to a producer of producing a good or service. Includes things like labor costs, materials, overhead, all that. And if we simply refer to cost as a C variable, if the cost, which is a dollar figure, goes up, we're going to find supply shifting left or as a decrease. If the cost of production is going down, then we would probably see an increase in supply. And this is the relationship between the two. And it makes sense, doesn't it? If the cost of doing business are rising, we're going to supply less output in a particular market. And I think we should also be clear that, and hopefully by this time in your degree program, that you will have understood that companies oftentimes don't just make one good, they make multiple goods, sometimes thousands of goods. And sometimes it costs more to make a particular good, and they decide we don't want to produce as much of that. It's, we can't get a higher price for it, and so we're going to make less of that and make something more of something else, particularly where we can control the cost a little better, and we'll decide to go and shift over to that particular area. And this goes on all throughout the economy. It's the changing cost of production. And it's not always just labor costs. Certainly for service firms, labor costs are important, probably the biggest cost of all, but it's all kinds of things, including, by the way, regulatory costs. And I said that we'd come back to regulation a bit. We talked about supply, and that's really an issue. The same goes with taxation. If taxes are rising, firms are going to supply less output. And by the way, if you consider tax to be another cost, then taxes, it works the same way. Costs are going up, supply goes down, or to the left. And the same goes with taxes. If taxes are going up, firms will supply less output. So let's simply insert taxes here to this particular picture. And so this is the relationship. Taxes, just another cost of doing business. Government spending, I'm jumping around here a little bit. Government spending, we'll talk about that a bit later, and that as to how that may impact the supply curve. But this is probably the biggest one that we ought to put a star by. Also, things like changes in technology, innovation throughout the economy. This is such a big one over such long time periods because it really explains why industries have grown over time and how supply can change. The thing about changes in technology is that, for the most part, most firms will adopt technology that's better than what they previously had because it allows them to do whatever it is they're doing more accurately, better, cheaper, faster, whatever, maybe all combinations of those variables. And it's almost always responsible for a rightward shift. And it goes to this idea of what we simply refer to in economics as productivity. Technology allows us to be more productive. We can produce more output per dollar figure than what it used to cost us in inputs. And the big story, obviously, over a very long time period, we're now a couple hundred years into the Industrial Revolution, is that a lot of times technology is used to replace labor inputs because technology does what it does and doesn't bring to the picture a lot of the sort of complicated human issues that labor does bring. And this is not an anti-labor statement. It's just simply a statement of observation based upon what is a long-term trend. And a lot of occupations will go away over time simply because they're replaced by technology, the jobs that simply no longer exist. And we're going to get to unemployment. If we don't get to unemployment today, we'll certainly talk much more about this when we talk about types of unemployment, one of which is very much influenced by technology. And so, and we'll talk about that and how it affects labor. Also, the number of sellers in the market, this is very similar to what we got to with regard to number of buyers. If there are more sellers in the market, supply curve is going to shift to the right, and as a result, more output at every price level. Sometimes if the demand has a change, it will bring the price down. And we'll get to that example here in a second. If the number of buyers or the number of sellers is leaving a market, then the supply curve shifts to the left. And a lot of times sellers will decide they no longer want to be in a particular market. And they'll go leaving that market for all kinds of reasons. And again, just as in the case of demand, there can be combinations of these things that go on here, right? As an example, and I go back to my own example as a banker, I had customers, we had gas stations who were customers. some of whom borrowed money from us, and some of whom were merely depositors. But during the early 90s, the government was really cracking down on environmental issues with regard to underground storage tanks. So we know if we go buy gas, I mean, the gas doesn't come from the pump that's above ground, it comes from a tank below ground, but those things can leak over time. And so there are all kinds of regulations about companies having to upgrade their storage tanks, sometimes yank them out. And some businesses decide, you know what, I'm thinking of one in particular, one client that said, I no longer want to sell gas. Number one, I don't make that much money on gas. I know it sounds crazy, but gas stations really don't make that much on gallons of gas. They really want you to come in and buy Cheetos and Slim Jims and Bud Light and all that. So he just decided to quit pumping gas and yanked them out of the ground and decided to shift over to doing something else. In other words, that one supplier, he was not alone at all. A lot of gas stations simply went out of business, and for a long time, you saw lots of empty gas station buildings, and we still sort of see, I think we still see some of that today. And one reason why is they left the market for all kinds of reasons. Okay, and then the final one here is outlook and expectations. When we're talking about a business outlook, we're talking about suppliers, and supply in the economy. Supply of goods and services, that is, dominated by corporations, and corporations oftentimes operate based upon what they expect to happen in coming accounting periods. And so if they're doing budgeting, it's based upon some realistic expectation of what the business outlook is going to be. It usually starts with some kind of forecast, oftentimes some kind of sales forecast. What's going to be the effect on the economy of what we're doing as suppliers? So if we think the economy is going to be pretty good, then we're going to ramp up our production. And we're seeing this happening in the last, I was just looking this morning about some of the GDP data, which stands for gross domestic product. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. That companies are ramping up their inventory because consumers are buying it. The economy is going very, very strong. I don't really understand why a lot of people think the economy is bad when all the variables are moving in the exact correct direction. And yet people don't feel like it is, probably because of inflation. That prices have not gone down, but that's the way prices do. And so they might go up, but they're not going to. How many goods do you see falling in price? The ones that do fall in price, they are mostly due to some other internal issues. And so expectations are an important one. Companies feel pretty good about it. We're talking about supply here. Maybe the demand side doesn't feel as confident about it, but they certainly are not behaving like they don't. So maybe a bit of a disconnect because we were told over and over about how the consumer is not happy, and yet unemployment is low, inflation has been falling, unemployment, has gone up a little bit, but not very much. I mean, we're probably still low full employment rate. Interest rates are falling. I mean, there are a lot of good things going on. So this is why businesses, for their part, at least are demonstrating confidence in the economy. They wouldn't dial up their inventory purchases and if they didn't expect to be able to sell them. And we have to believe that at least that they are pretty accurate in what they're looking at. Okay, one final bit here on chapter 3, and I think we're going to sort of wrap this up here. And what I'll probably do is stop the recording just so I can sort of regroup and reset everything for the next chapter, which is going to be an all macro chapter. That's chapter 6, and I'll take a second in order to do that. But let's talk about putting demand and supply together, and we're going to arrive at something called equilibrium. And let's talk about equilibrium. But before I get into this sort of formal definition, let's take a look at and sort of model this here on the board. So we're going to put we've looked at demand in isolation. We've looked at supply in isolation. Let's put them both together now and talk about what this thing looks like, okay? And what the relationship is between all of these variables. And so let's do another PQ plane here. So we've got quantity on this axis, we've got price on this axis. We've got a downward sloping demand curve and looking something like that. And sometimes the slopes of these can differ, but we're not getting into that here. And we've got an upward sloping supply curve. And that red doesn't stick very much. And so we've got this. We've got two functions that go in different directions. Not surprising at all, okay? And yet, even though we went to sort of great lengths to talk about the conflict between buyers and sellers, and conflict may be a strong word, maybe not, but sellers want high prices, and so as a result, if prices go up, they're going to supply more quantity. If prices go down, they're going to supply less quantity. But a difference on the demand side, if prices go down, we demand more quantity. If prices go up, we demand less quantity. So we've got two different forces pushing against one another. And yet we can arrive at a point of what we call equilibrium. And that is where the markets will, in a short run condition, settle into a price and settle into a quantity that's considered to be relatively stable. And we simply refer to that condition and that point here along in this graph as equilibrium, which is a condition of stability. And wherever in economics we have a condition of short-term stability where things are relatively constant, we put a little asterisk or a star, whatever we usually refer to as P star, Q star, and that simply represents a point of equilibrium or a point of balance. And it doesn't mean that markets can't get out of equilibrium, but the theory of equilibrium that has been developed over a very long time period is the idea that if the market is relatively rational, that it will move itself back to equilibrium or maybe to a new equilibrium. We are talking about something short term. And I know the question comes up a lot of times about, well, what is short term? How do you define short term? Is that a year? And in the accounting world, we tend to think of short term as being a year or less. Is it something different? And the answer is it really depends. And I know it's not a very good answer. It's an economist's answer. I know that economists drive people crazy when they give these very vague answers, but it really does depend. That we know that prices will change over time. We know that quantities are going to change over time because these functions, supply and demand, are going to be themselves shifting over time. But in the very short run, we know we often have very stable prices and very stable quantities. And I know that's not exactly what people are feeling right now, but if you consider the fact that we are not usually that surprised at the price of a good, even with the inflationary conditions that we've had in the last couple of years, we're not like completely shocked at the price of bread. In fact, some products like bread have not really moved much in terms of price. Other products like eggs were shooting up in price, mostly because the supply curve was shifting to the left and you had a high price as a result of that. And I think it was some sort of disease or something among chickens or whatever it was. And then once that stabilized, the prices came right back down. We're not at a different price. Nobody's really talking about the price of eggs. Or for a time there, about a year and a half ago, I guess everyone was talking about the price of eggs and how it doubled and whatnot. Those are short-term conditions, but we've come back to equilibrium. Likewise, probably a better bit of evidence, if you don't like the price evidence, then think about the quantity evidence. Sometimes we have an overproduction of goods, and we simply refer to that as a surplus, or sometimes an underproduction that we call a shortage, and those are out of equilibrium conditions. But how many goods are you experiencing that have wild surpluses where the goods are just spilling out all over everywhere and can't move in a grocery store because there's just too much inventory that they can't sell? Not really, right? Or how many times when goods are completely wiped off the shelves? And I know that during COVID, we had a bit of, I don't know, a little bit of irrationality where people were buying a lot of things like paper products and cleansers and whatnot. We had a lot of shortages of those, but that didn't last really that long. I mean, that period of sort of manic buying lasted about a year, if that. And I think people kind of maybe came to their senses. It was always a little bit irrational. By the way, one thing that surprised me was during COVID that people weren't rushing to buy bottles of water. We didn't have any kind of shortage of that. We had shortages of a lot of other things like Clorox wipes. Those were hard to come by, and people were marking up and selling them on eBay and whatnot. But you can't eat those or drink those, but yet bottled water, there was no shortage of necessarily, and really no shortage of a lot of food products. So it was something different. It was something that we all had to kind of get used to. And let's hope that we don't have to deal with that again in our lifetimes. Obviously, I have no idea whether or not that will happen or not. But that's what's going on with equilibrium. Okay, and so to give you a bit of a definition, and this is going to be this, and then I've got one other thing to talk about. We're going to be discussion about what equilibrium will look like with time. Let's first of all give a sort of a rigorous definition of equilibrium here. And so equilibrium is defined as a condition of relative short-term balance or stability, whichever you want to refer to it. And it's as to price and quantity. And remember, it's got to be both price and quantity. And that's how we know that we've got a condition of stability. And I think most markets in a developed economy where we've got lots of information between buyers and sellers, lots of buyers coming in, buyers free to come in or free to leave, sellers coming in, free to come in, free to leave. There's very few barriers. Then we're going to have markets that are relatively stable in the short run, but over the long run will change, and things will change over long time periods. So remember, it's as to price and quantity. So the equilibrium price, which we're going to call P star, is the price at which an equilibrium quantity Q star exists. One cannot exist without the other. That the condition is both price and quantity. So we have P star associated with some Q star. But when we talk about this idea of Q star or equilibrium quantity, we're saying there are no surpluses. A surplus is where the quantity supply is so much bigger than the quantity demand. We've just got too much of some good. And where we do have these, they don't last long usually. And no shortages where quantity supply is much less than quantity demanded. And the theory of this general equilibrium theory is that if there's a surplus, there's too much production of something, whatever it is. Let's say there's a market in which there's just a way overproduction of shoes, let's say. Well, what's going to happen? There's too many shoes out there, and so the price of shoes is going to come down. That's going to mean, because sellers want to get rid of all these shoes as inventory. And as a result, the price of shoes comes down, which means that quantity demanded is going to go up. Eventually, it will close the surplus back to some equilibrium condition. That's how surpluses go away, where there's too much output. Or it could be that the price now is so low because of this excess of shoes that some sellers are going to go out of business because they can't survive on those low prices. They can't cover their costs with those low prices, which is another way of saying that quantity supply will go down where it's too high to begin with relative to quantity demand. A shortage is a little bit trickier because sometimes shortages are caused by things which are completely non-economic: wars, famine, disease, and certainly, and I've been doing this for a long time, and we've talked about wars, famines, diseases, and I guess I never envisioned where we would be living through a pandemic where we had shortages, mostly because the supply side could not continue operating because a lot of firms were closed down, a lot of labor was constricted, a lot of goods weren't moving. We saw particularly goods that came from far away, and we have a big reliance upon suppliers, particularly in East Asia, where a lot of these are component parts that are necessary to make some final good. And because they're not arriving, because they were sort of backed up in the ocean, frankly, literally, the quantity supply was far less than the quantity demanded. And the only way this can fix itself is if we can get the supply back in line with quantity demanded. And we would prefer that supply goes up, quantity supply goes up, as opposed to quantity demand going down, because that means a downturn in the economy. And frankly, we did see a bit of a drop in the quantity demand of some goods. And we did have a downturn in the economy overall in 2020. It was a very short recession. It's probably seemed like it was longer, but what happened was the government sort of stepped in to try to ameliorate the downturn and was mostly successful. In fact, if anything, you can make a very strong argument that the government went too far in its dealing with it and pumped too much stimulus into the economy, and we all got checks in our bank accounts. Even though some of us were still working, my wife and I were still working, and yet it was free money. So hey, all right, it was kind of an interesting thing. We hadn't really seen that much of before. And then businesses had an array of different programs to help them stay afloat. There's the Paycheck Protection Program. There were tax abatements that businesses were dealing with. Sometimes they got credits for maintaining hiring and keeping workforce employed. So, and we're going to talk much more about government support in the economy, not so much necessarily dealing with COVID, but COVID was such an important thing that I think it was important for us to sort of keep in mind that it was pretty good test case or how effective it is when government steps in, try to do things in the economy to try to solve problems. And I know sometimes people don't want government to solve problems, but that's usually it's oftentimes, in my mind at least, people say that they maybe don't mean it, particularly when the support comes their way. And I think we're all willing to take something that's coming our way. Frankly, I don't buy the argument that people say government ought to go away. If that were the case, I don't think we would like the results very much. But there are people who will say that. So one final thing that we should get to, and that is the idea: what happens to equilibrium when we have shifts in these market dynamics? So I'm going to draw what we would refer to as four quadrants dealing with different shifts, and we want to talk about what the effects are going to be. And I want to talk about shifts in demand along the top row here. Okay, we'll stop that there. And then I want to talk about shifts in supply along the bottom of this. And I want to talk about shifts to the right and shifts to the left in each of these. And so let's do this now. And so let's put this together. We've got price and quantity, and we're going to model 4 different sets of shifts. And one thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to shift one at a time and leave the other side alone. And I know in your textbook, in every textbook of an introductory nature, we will have simultaneous shifts. But in my mind, I think it's a little bit beyond where we really want to go here, frankly, because I think it's easier for us not to get into too much complication. But let's talk about shifts in demand and shifts in supply. And so let's model some of these changes here and see what they look like. Okay, so we'll put a demand curve here. We're going to call that D1 because we're going to be shifting it. We're going to call this D1 as well because we're going to be shifting that. We're going to leave D alone here along the bottom because it's just going to be supply relationships that shift. Okay, let's talk about demand shifts, and let's talk about a rightward shift first of all. So let's say that we've got some equilibrium condition, a point of adjacency between supply and demand, and so we're going to call that P1 and a little star because it's an equilibrium condition. So we'll put a little star by it. And this star notation that we use with these variables, again, is very common throughout economics. We see it happening even in macro as well. So what do we have a rightward shift? In other words, what may be happening, who knows? What buyers coming into the market, they want more of this good for whatever reason. Their tastes and preferences are changing, and so as a result, what happens? We have an increase in the quantity demanded, but we also have an increase in the price of the good. And what's happening is we see this a lot where demand is rising faster than supply. And as a result, supply is only as productive as what it can provide. And demand can sometimes move faster than supply. And so as a result, what happens? The price of the good goes up. Think about this from the seller's perspective. I know that it looks like we're only modeling the buyer's perspective, but what if you're a seller and buyers are banging down your door to get the product? What are you going to do? You're going to raise the price, and why not, right? If everyone got a tax cut, right, and people now are going to rush out to buy clothes and motorcycles and whatever, and these goods are flying out of your shelf, flying off shelves, flying out of your showroom, you're going to raise the price of the good. You just will do that, and that's just the way markets work, and we know that. So in this case, if the supply side is unable to catch up, we're going to have not only a rise in the quantity exchange. That's really what Q is, particularly in an equilibrium. It's a new equilibrium. We've gone from one equilibrium to a new equilibrium point, and we've got a higher price as a result of that. This is one explanation for why prices go up over time and why they don't go down. And I know that when I say this, that the economy is one in which prices go up and don't come down, people will say, well, what about iPhones or laptop computers? They've all come down in price. And I say, yes, but that's more due to cost relationships as these firms are able to dial up their production and there's competition and there are all kinds of factors. And it's more of a supply side issue than a demand side issue. And by the way, there are really not that many goods in the economy that go down in price over time. I can't think of that many really where the price comes down. It's mostly high-tech goods where companies are dialing up their production, and as a result, they're able to lower price. They're also attracting competition. So these are all factors that may influence it. Okay. All right, so that's a rightward shift in demand. That's the effect on equilibrium. What about a leftward shift in demand? So here, let's say we start out with some D1 and it's associated with some Q1 equilibrium, Q1 star and some P1 star. That's the equilibrium condition of demand and supply. And now we've got a leftward shift in demand. Whatever is going on here, maybe it's a rise in taxes and people have got less money to spend, or it's a fall in incomes, or it's a change in expectations. People aren't very eager about things. They don't feel very confident, so they're going to demand less output. The quantity is going to go down, and maybe the price will fall. Now, this is the traditional thing that we know is that when buyers stay away from the market and the supply side, when buyers stay away, the suppliers can't really change. Suppliers will lower price in order to get rid of goods, knowing that this may be something they can't deal with. I think we have to remove ourselves from the myth that sellers are in control of price. I would argue that price is more of a given that they sort of take. And yes, if they can influence the price of the good, like if they're a monopoly, a single seller, then yeah, that's a different story. But there really aren't very many monopolies in the country. There just really are not. And where they exist, there's also a lot of regulation preventing them from keeping prices artificially high. And we have long had enforcement of that. And we don't talk about that very much in this course. We do in micro, but that's what's going on there. As to whether or not the price will fall, maybe it's a short run condition. When we get into the macro elements of this, we start taking demand and sort of expanding it beyond the view of one market in the entire economy. We're going to refer to this as aggregate demand. That is all demand for all goods and services, aggregate supply, all goods and all services. Then we might see that this price mechanism is what we call downwardly inflexible. Prices go up, they kind of stay there, but they don't really come down for most goods. And I know that the example of the eggs was one. It was a very short-term condition. We got back to a condition of stability pretty darn quickly. We really did. And it's not that they went up and stayed up, it's that the market got back in equilibrium because it got knocked out of equilibrium by something that was outside of the dynamics of demand and supply. In general, though, we are going to talk about this idea that prices going down because of buyers leaving is a little bit questionable, particularly in a macro sense. And the evidence for this is something that I don't really need to hopefully convince you of, because I think we've seen prices for a lot of goods go up in the last couple of years, and maybe they've sort of stabilized, but they're not going down. I mean, I just look at things like Powerade and Gatorade and all these beverage products that we see. The prices have gone up, and they just kind of stopped going up, and they didn't go down, right? And there are a lot of reasons for that, and some of which we'll get to a bit later. Okay, that's a demand. Those are the demand shifts. That's the effect on equilibrium. What about a supply shift? So let's take the opposite side of the market. Say we've got some equilibrium point. We'll call that Q1 or P1 Q1, whichever you want to prefer. So it's X in terms of the that particular ordered pair. And now let's say we've got a rightward shift in supply for whatever reason. Maybe taxes are coming down. Maybe interest rates are falling. That's one thing we didn't really talk about as a determinant. We will get to that a bit later. And so as a result, if demand, supply is shifting, maybe more suppliers are coming in, whatever, it means more quantity is going to be exchanged, and it's going to be at a lower price. And this we can have why we're more confident about this issue than we are in this issue, even though the price is still going down in both cases, is because a lot of markets which attract new competition definitely see a decrease in price of those goods as more firms come in order to compete in those particular businesses. And we do see this happening where competition runs into a market and it forces the prices down, and the beneficiary of that are the demand side actors. We as buyers benefit from that, and there's a reason why in the U.S. economy and the legal structure of the U.S. economy, we value competition, and we want competition because it keeps prices a little bit lower and it modifies any kind of increase in price. And that's the good thing about competition. We value competition a lot more than we do over consolidation. Sometimes that is having fewer sellers in the market. Sometimes it doesn't always seem like that's the case, but that is ultimately what the legal structure is geared to achieving. Okay. One final scenario here is we've got another, and this is the final one. This is we've got some Q1, P1 ordered pair that represents the initial equilibrium condition. And now we've got a leftward shift in supply. Again, don't think about right left, because if you think a rightward shift which is increase, looks like it's going down, and this is a decrease, but looks like it's going up. So don't make that mistake here. So we have a leftward shift. Could be sellers are leaving the market. It could be that the regulatory costs of this industry are too onerous for the sellers and they're leaving. They're going away, they're providing less output, less quantities being exchanged, and what does get exchanged gets done at a higher price. This is simply a manifestation of scarcity. And we don't mean scarcity in the sense of scarcity in everything, but there is a relative scarcity in a particular product when sellers are leaving the market or exiting for whatever reason. And it could be a lot of things. It could be higher taxes that discourage them from producing more output. Taxes are another cost of doing business, and so as a result, higher taxes might cause this leftward shift. And it could be the case that companies don't want to face higher taxes. And by the way, when it comes to the cost of production, and again, taxes are one of numerous costs of production. This explains too why businesses for many years have been moving a lot of their operations to other countries, certainly to Latin America, but also to East Asia and other parts of the world because of lower costs. And it's certainly lower labor costs, but it is not just labor alone. It's also lower taxes, lower regulatory costs, less red tape in terms of compliance with regulations and whatnot. And companies have been doing this forever. They're trying to move to areas where they can have lower costs, because higher costs mean they produce less. They don't want that. They want lower costs so they can produce more. And then that's what allows them to get well above break even and to make as much money as possible. And we make the case in economics that business firms exist to maximize profit. And most economists are left, right, and center along the political spectrum are pretty clear about this idea of why businesses do what they do, because they want to maximize profit. Okay. All right. So that sort of does it for this discussion of chapter 3. If you have questions about this, let me know. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to maybe set these into 2 different videos. I'm going to sort of stop this recording here and upload it on one different link. And that kind of gives you an opportunity to maybe catch your breath a little bit and maybe refer to one segment rather than putting both these together, because I'm going to transition into chapter 6, which is the beginning of our macro piece, which is where we're going to stay for the rest of the remainder of the term. We're going to focus on macro. So I think it's probably, I didn't plan to do this originally, but I think that it makes sense. So I'll give you 2 different links, and they're going to deal with 2 different topics. And I think I'm probably not going to get into unemployment. And I think, which was scheduled for week 3, it's chapter 8. But I think it's perfectly fine to do. I think it actually makes sense to do, because unemployment and inflation, which is scheduled for week 4, do kind of go together and in a logical way. They're very much linked to one another. Even though they're different things, they are sort of bound up in this sort of an inverse relationship in their own right. And I think it makes sense. And the other part of week 4 is chapter 10, which we're not going to be covering in great detail. It's not really the main thrust of this course, but is one that we will cover just because it is part of the course design. So anyway, if anybody has any questions about this, feel free to contact me. I'm available all weekend. Email me. It's a great way to reach me. If you want to text me, that's fine too. I gave the class my cell phone text number, so you can feel free to do that as well. And hopefully, if there are questions you've got and are unable to reach me throughout the weekend, we haven't yet come up on our first exam yet. On Mondays, I usually post a bit of an update in Brightspace to tell where things are. And I know that I haven't seen a lot of you in this class because not everyone's been in class for all kinds of reasons. And hopefully we'll get everyone here next Thursday so that we can talk about the exam, which I believe is coming up in next week. Next week is the first exam. So we want to make sure that we have time to talk about that. Okay. All right. I will pick this up with another link to the macro piece and look for that. And again, let me know if you have any questions.